For this week's Think Tank Central on what to watch out for in the upcoming NATO summit, we're joined from Ontario by Professor Stefanie von Hlatky of Canada's Queen's Centre for International and Defence Policy, and from Brussels, Brooks Tigner, NATO Affairs Analyst for Jane's Defence Weekly and founding editor of Security Europe. Stefanie, let's start with you. After the bizarre way that Trump lashed out at your prime minister at the recent G7 summit in Canada, do you expect more or less confrontation in Brussels, given his continued beef with all but a handful of the NATO members, including Canada, who are not living up to defense spending targets?
Well, I think that the G7 is still very much on everyone's mind, and so we're all anticipating the NATO summit. One lesson to take away from the G7 is that allies don't like to be surprised. So if anything, it'd be nice to see the NATO restore a little bit of that trust and that predictability. But predictability and Trump don't really go together.
Indeed, indeed. Brooks, are you sensing any erosion in the transatlantic alliance or even a weakening of America's commitment to the Article 5 Collective Defense Clause?
Well, hi, Barbara. Those are the two questions. In a word, I would say yes. We're not sure if the weakening is taking place yet, but certainly the doubts are hanging very heavily over these two issues. When Mr. Trump compares NATO as worse than NAFTA or says the EU is worse than China, we know at this point that transatlantic political relations are in a pretty parlous state. And it's even worse when Mr. Trump hesitates about the legitimacy of Putin's seizure of Crimea. As we know, a few days ago, he told journalists when asked about that legitimacy, well, we'll have to see. I mean, this is explosive stuff.
And what about the Article 5 Collective Defense Clause?
Well, that still stands, but I think coming back to this Crimea thing is critical because the official line of NATO and the EU all along, from the very start, since Putin seized Crimea in 2014, has been unequivocal condemnation and a refusal ever to recognize this. So for the President of the United States suddenly to throw that into doubt places the legitimacy of NATO in question, or at least the solidarity of NATO in question, and places a big question mark over the Article 5 commitment because it undermines the whole concept of NATO acting as one.
Stefanie, Ukraine and Georgia, two countries that have been targeted by Russia. They're NATO partners, but not full-fledged members subject to Article 5 protection. What do you expect to be on the agenda with regard to the Russian threat, and should we all look out for a reaffirmation of that Article 5 Collective Defense Clause?
Well, Article 5 is already well established. It's in the founding treaty of NATO, the Washington Treaty, which dates back to 1949. Now, since then, NATO allies have worked hard to reaffirm their commitment, both in words and in deeds. And in the communique, you can expect to see some strong language vis-a-vis the threat that Russia poses and various measures that NATO is undertaking collectively to strengthen its deterrence capability and its core mandate of collective defense.
Because of some concern of an erosion of American commitment to the Article 5 clause?
Well, I think that we can see some consistency on that front. Ever since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, what you've seen in the communique is very precise language vis-a-vis Russia, and then specific commitments and initiatives which are meant to bolster collective defense capabilities, but at the same time, reassure allies. Now, as you mentioned earlier, Georgia and Ukraine, for example, are not allies, they are partners. And on that front, NATO is expected, as it has done previously, to continue its open door policy and to pursue partnership relationships as a means to bolster regional stability.
Brooks, talking about Russia, is there a point beyond which the alliance will not tolerate Turkey's growing strategic cooperation with Moscow? As you know, it's moving forward with the deal to deploy Russian S-400 air defense systems, despite U.S. and allied concern that it will undermine capabilities of the new F-35 stealth fighter. And then, of course, Turkey is waging its own freelance war against the Kurds in Syria, which is seriously complicating the coalition's war against ISIS.
Well, again, very tough question. Again, I'm not sure that that NATO will come out and condemn Turkey on those issues. It hasn't in the past, and certainly as we saw during the failed 2000 coup, there was severe private criticism of what Turkey was doing within NATO circles. But publicly, it was silence, or it was an expression of solidarity for an allied government that had been under attack. Same thing for the Kurdish question. So, and unless there was a wholesale union between Turkey and Russia, I think Turkey has great leverage to pretty much do whatever it wants, and allowing it to swim between NATO, the U.S., and Russia as it pleases.
Stefanie, at last year's summit, Trump publicly shamed NATO allies, driving them across the coals for not meeting the 2% of GDP spending goals, and insisting over and over again that the U.S. spends more on defense than all the NATO member countries combined. So I want to ask you, who are the most egregious slackers? How realistic will it be for them to meet those spending targets? And perhaps should there be another way of measuring an individual nation's contribution to the alliance?
That's a great question, Barbara, or a series of questions. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to the 2% rule. The first one is that allies had 10 years to meet that target, and this was a target that was really set in 2014. Mm-hmm. So this insistence on meeting the 2% rule immediately is simply not realistic.
Right.
And the other misconception is that burden sharing debates within NATO are longstanding. And every time there is a summit, there's either the U.S. Secretary of Defense or the president himself who will admonish allies for not spending enough on defense. Mm-hmm.
And the measurement?
When it comes, yes, the measurement is another crucial aspect. And so last year in Brussels, during President Trump's first visit to NATO as President of the United States, the 2% rule was mentioned again. And what the Secretary General of NATO reaffirmed is that cash is important, but there are also two C's that matters, the capabilities and the contribution. So how are you spending that money in terms of capabilities that are relevant for NATO missions? Mm-hmm. And then are individual allies contributing troops to ongoing NATO missions?
Right.
And on that front, it's pretty easy to track who's doing what when it comes to supporting NATO objectives.
Well, we look forward to the communique that will be issued at the end of this important summit. Professor Stefanie von Hlatky and Brooks Tigner,